begin with breaking news. A former sports reporter and anchor was found dead in a home in Hoover this morning. Good evening, I'm Sherry Jackson.
The scene was described as controlled, quiet, and already explained. 2 bodies, 1 home, and a conclusion delivered almost immediately. For a moment, it appeared there were no loose ends to chase, no unanswered questions, no reason to look deeper. But what happens when a case labeled closed begins to fracture under its own timeline? A familiar face from television, a career built on public trust, and a final story that does not behave the way police say it should. This video examines a breaking case involving Christina Chambers, a respected TV sports reporter found dead inside her home alongside her husband.
She was just a beautiful person, and she was a great athlete. She loved her new job, loved what she did in the past. She always talked about it, you know.
A case authorities quickly classified as a murder-suicide. At first glance, the explanation seemed straightforward. Officials described the sequence as tragic but conclusive. The narrative was delivered with confidence. The file, according to early statements, was already nearing closure. Then something shifted. Just as investigators believed the case was essentially solved, a newly surfaced detail emerged. A detail that does not fit the original account and forces the entire timeline to be reconsidered. That detail did not come from rumors. It did not come from social media speculation. It came from within the case itself. And once that clue appeared, everything changed. Why was this information not emphasized earlier? Why does it surface only after the narrative was already shaped? And why does it raise new questions about intent, sequence, and certainty? This was the moment the case stopped moving toward closure and began moving backward. The deaths of Christina Chambers and her husband were presented as a tragic end to a private crisis. But certain elements refused to stay aligned. Timelines show tension. Statements leave gaps. And one specific discovery challenges whether the final explanation accounts for everything that happened inside that home. If the conclusion was correct, this detail should not matter. But it does. This is not a retelling. This is not commentary. This is a reconstruction of what changed and why investigators may now be forced to look again at a case they believed was already over. Stay with this report to understand what was found when it surfaced and how one overlooked detail disrupted an entire conclusion. Because sometimes the most important clue appears only after the story is told and forces it to be told again. The call no one expected. On Tuesday, December 16th, law enforcement authorities in Hoover, Alabama, responded to what was initially described as a routine welfare concern rather than an emergency involving violence. According to official statements later issued by the Hoover Police Department, the response was prompted after a family member became concerned when a married couple failed to appear at a scheduled church event. The absence was not immediately framed as alarming, but it was considered unusual enough to justify a personal check on the residents. At that stage, there were no reports of a disturbance, no emergency calls originating from the home, and no indication that officers were being dispatched to an active crime scene. Within minutes of arrival, however, the nature of the call changed entirely. Officers entering the residence located 2 adults deceased inside the home, both later confirmed to have died from gunshot wounds. The transition from a welfare check to a fatal investigation occurred without any intervening public alert, underscoring how abruptly the situation shifted from concern to confirmation. What appeared at first to be a quiet absence had already concealed a final and irreversible outcome. Police quickly secured the scene and confirmed that the couple's 3-year-old child was also inside the home at the time of discovery. The child was found physically unharmed, a fact emphasized repeatedly in early statements. This detail narrowed the possible sequence of events, but simultaneously introduced a significant evidentiary gap. The precise duration during which the child had been alone in the residence was not disclosed. The lack of a defined timeline immediately complicated any effort to reconstruct what occurred before officers arrived. Public reporting indicated that the child opened the door to a family member who had come to check on the household after the missed church appearance. That moment, brief and procedural, became the first verified interaction following the deaths. No emergency call preceded it. No neighbor reported hearing gunshots. No alarm or distress signal was documented. The absence of external triggers raised questions not about what was found, but about how long it had remained unseen. A striking pattern emerged. Authorities confirmed outcomes but withheld mechanics. Gunshot wounds were acknowledged, but no information was released regarding the number of shots fired, weapon location, or the sequence of injuries. There was no immediate discussion of time of death estimates, ballistic analysis, or scene reconstruction. The investigation began with certainty about the result, but restraint about the process. By the time the scene was stabilized, law enforcement had effectively moved from response to classification. The residence was treated as a contained environment with no indication of forced entry disclosed publicly. That absence would later become central to how the case was framed. Despite the fact that lack of forced entry by itself does not establish causation, what mattered was not only what officers observed, but what they chose not to detail. It became clear that the call itself was no longer the focus. Attention shifted instead to what the call revealed too late. The welfare check did not interrupt an event in progress. It uncovered a scene that had already reached its end. That distinction carries weight because it means the critical actions occur beyond observation, beyond immediate documentation, and beyond any possibility of real-time verification. From an investigative perspective, the nature of the call shaped everything that followed. Because it was not initiated as an emergency, no contemporaneous timestamps were generated to anchor the moment of death. Because no disturbance was reported, no auditory or visual corroboration existed outside the home. And because the discovery was delayed until absence became noticeable, the window for precise reconstruction narrowed significantly. Based strictly on the sequence described in official and public reporting, the initial call functioned less as an intervention and more as a delayed confirmation. That delay likely limits the evidentiary clarity available to investigators, meaning that early conclusions may rely heavily on scene context rather than time-specific forensic reconstruction. A public figure identified. Following the initial confirmation that 2 adults had been found deceased inside the Hoover residence, authorities formally identified one of the individuals as Christina Chambers, age 38. Public reporting described Chambers as a former television sports reporter with a professional background that extended beyond broadcast journalism into education. At the time of her death, she was employed as a high school journalism teacher, a role that positioned her within both a public-facing media sphere and a local institutional setting. The identification immediately altered the scope of attention surrounding the case, shifting it from a private domestic matter to one involving a recognizable public figure. Within the first 50 words of Chambers being named, emphasis moved quickly to her career. Reports noted her previous employment with WBRC6 News and referenced her work in sports journalism, a field that often places individuals in visible, trusted roles within their communities. These details were factual and verifiable, but they were not investigative in nature. They did not clarify the circumstances of the deaths, nor did they provide context for the events inside the home. What they did establish was that the case would not remain confined to a single street or neighborhood. Shortly thereafter, Chambers was also identified as an educator. Statements attributed to Alabaster City Schools Superintendent Wayne Vickers describe her as a teacher who had formed meaningful connections with students and demonstrated dedication to her profession. Such remarks were consistent with institutional responses following the death of an employee and were not accompanied by any indication that her professional life was under review as part of the investigation. No workplace disputes, disciplinary actions, or security concerns were cited in either official statements or public reporting. The contrast between Chambers' professional visibility and the private setting of the deaths became pronounced. The case involved a woman whose career depended on communication and public engagement, yet the circumstances of her death were entirely contained within a closed domestic environment. This contrast did not generate evidence, but it shaped perception, encouraging assumptions of narrative completeness before factual details had been released. The second individual was identified as Johnny Rhymes Jr., age 41, Chambers' husband. Beyond his age and marital status, limited public information was provided about him. Law enforcement did not disclose his occupation, background, or any prior interactions with authorities. The imbalance in available information was not the result of selective omission, but rather of public interest patterns that naturally gravitated toward the more recognizable name. It was evident that Chambers' public identity was influencing the trajectory of coverage. Community reactions, professional tributes, and institutional statements occupied space that might otherwise have been devoted to evidentiary clarification. The case was being contextualized through biography rather than reconstruction. Importantly, neither law enforcement nor public reporting suggested that Chambers' status as a journalist or teacher was connected to motive or causation. No threats related to her work were cited. No external actors were named. The identification served primarily to inform, not to implicate. The early foregrounding of Christina Chambers' public-facing career likely accelerated the perception that the case narrative was already understood. While her identification was necessary and appropriate, the surrounding emphasis on professional legacy may have contributed to a premature sense of closure, despite the absence of disclosed forensic or chronological detail. Initial scene assessment. According to official statements released by the Hoover Police Department, the initial assessment of the residence began only after officers entered the home and confirmed the presence of 2 deceased adults. Both individuals were determined to have sustained fatal gunshot wounds. No further descriptive detail regarding the nature of those wounds was released at the time of discovery. Investigators did not publicly specify the number of shots fired, the anatomical locations of the injuries, or whether the wounds were immediately determined to be fatal. The early assessment therefore established cause of death in a general sense, while leaving the mechanics of injury undefined. Within the first stage of scene control, officers secured the residence and confirmed that there was no ongoing threat. Public reporting did not indicate any signs of forced entry, damaged access points, or exterior disturbance. The absence of forced entry was referenced without elaboration and without qualification as to whether all points of access had been examined or whether any were excluded from public description. Such omissions are consistent with standard investigative practice, but limit the ability to evaluate how the scene configuration informed later conclusions. The presence of the couple's 3-year-old child inside the home at the time of discovery added a critical layer to the initial assessment. Police confirmed the child was physically unharmed. No information was released regarding the child's precise location within the residence when officers arrived, nor whether the child had been asleep or awake during the relevant period. There was also no public disclosure regarding whether medical or forensic evaluation of the child was conducted beyond confirmation of physical safety. The confirmation of no injury resolved one concern, while simultaneously narrowing the window of uncertainty surrounding the sequence of events. It became apparent that investigators were distinguishing between what could be stated immediately and what required further examination. The scene was treated as contained, and there were no indications of a broader public safety risk. However, no timeline estimates were provided. There was no mention of rigor mortis, livor mortis, or environmental indicators that might suggest time of death. Without those benchmarks, the initial assessment remained descriptive rather than reconstructive. Public reporting did not indicate whether a firearm was recovered at the scene during the initial assessment, nor whether any weapon was documented in proximity to either body. No information was provided regarding shell casings, ballistic trajectories, or bloodstain pattern analysis. These elements, while often central to determining sequence and responsibility, were not included in early disclosures. The absence of such detail did not contradict later conclusions, but it did prevent independent evaluation of how those conclusions were reached. As the scene transitioned from discovery to investigation, law enforcement emphasized procedural containment. The residence was secured, and access was restricted. There was no indication that neighboring homes were canvassed immediately for audio or visual corroboration, nor that surveillance footage from nearby properties had been referenced in early statements. The assessment focused inward on what was found, rather than outward on what might contextualize it. A structural pattern emerged. The initial scene assessment confirmed outcome and safety, but deferred explanation. This approach aligns with protocol when investigators believe the scene itself provides sufficient context for preliminary classification. However, without public articulation of that context, the assessment remained opaque. Based solely on the information released, the initial scene assessment appears to have prioritized stabilization and classification over evidentiary transparency. While such restraint is not unusual, It suggests that subsequent conclusions may rely heavily on undisclosed scene interpretation rather than publicly articulated forensic benchmarks, leaving critical aspects of sequence and causation outside the public record. Murder-suicide announced. On Wednesday, December 17th, the Hoover Police Department issued a formal update stating that investigators were treating the deaths as a murder-suicide. The announcement marked the first time authorities publicly applied a definitive classification to the case. While the statement acknowledged that the investigation remained active, the terminology itself carried legal and procedural significance, signaling that investigators had reached an internal determination regarding the nature of the deaths based on information not fully disclosed to the public. Within the first portion of the announcement, police reiterated previously confirmed facts. 2 adults were found deceased inside the home, both having suffered fatal gunshot wounds, and a minor child present in the residence was unharmed. The update did not introduce new forensic detail. Instead, it reframed existing information under a categorical conclusion. The shift from description to designation occurred without a parallel release of supporting evidence. Critically, the statement did not identify which individual was believed to have carried out the shooting. No attribution of responsibility was made, nor was any explanation offered regarding the sequence of events that led investigators to the murder-suicide conclusion. In standard investigative practice, such determinations are often based on scene context, weapon location, and wound analysis. However, none of these elements were articulated in the public record at the time of the announcement. The conclusion was presented as settled, even as its foundation remained largely unarticulated. A notable tension emerged between finality and caution. Authorities stated that they were still investigating, a phrase that typically implies unresolved questions or pending analysis. Yet the use of the murder-suicide label suggested that, at least in terms of causation, investigators believed the evidentiary threshold had been met. This dual posture, investigation ongoing, conclusion assigned, introduced ambiguity into the official narrative. Public reporting following the announcement reflected this ambiguity. Coverage consistently referenced the murder-suicide designation, while simultaneously noting the lack of detail regarding how that conclusion was reached. No mention was made of ballistic testing results, gunshot residue analysis, or autopsy findings. There was no discussion of whether time of death estimates supported a specific sequence, nor whether any physical evidence conclusively distinguished between perpetrator and victim roles. The absence of such information did not negate the classification, but it limited external scrutiny of its basis. The classification itself began to shape public understanding more than any underlying fact. The term murder-suicide carries implicit assumptions regarding motive, agency, and sequence. Once applied, it tends to narrow interpretive space, directing attention away from alternative explanations unless contradicted by subsequent evidence. In this case, no contradictory evidence was presented publicly, but neither was corroborating detail. Law enforcement did not indicate whether the decision was provisional or subject to revision pending additional findings. The language used suggested confidence, but not finality in a legal sense, as no criminal proceedings were possible given the deaths involved. The case, therefore, entered a procedural category where investigative conclusions are often reached internally without adversarial testing. Based solely on official statements and public reporting, the murder-suicide announcement appears to reflect an internal evidentiary assessment that has not been fully translated into the public domain. While such assessments are routinely made in domestic death investigations, the absence of disclosed supporting detail means the classification rests on authority rather than transparency, a dynamic that may leave aspects of the case unresolved in the public record even as it moves toward administrative closure. The timeline tightens. As official statements and public reporting were reviewed together, the chronology of events surrounding the deaths narrowed considerably, even as precise timestamps remained absent. What could be established with relative certainty was not when the fatal acts occurred, but when they were discovered. The family's failure to attend a scheduled church event on Tuesday, December 16th, functioned as the first external indicator that something was wrong. That absence prompted concern from relatives, eventually leading a family member to travel to the Hoover residence to check on the household. This sequence, while simple, effectively defined the outer boundary of the timeline. According to public reporting, The couple's 3-year-old child opened the door to the family member who arrived at the home. This interaction represents the earliest confirmed post-incident contact involving anyone outside the residence. The child was found physically unharmed, and no report indicated that the child was in distress at the time of the door being opened. What remains unspecified is how long the child had been alone prior to that moment, or whether either parent was still alive at any point during that interval. The timeline tightened not through additional detail, but through the recognition of what could no longer be expanded. A critical limitation became clear. There were no emergency calls originating from the residence. No neighbors reported hearing gunshots. No alarms or electronic alerts were referenced in official statements. The absence of these markers eliminated several common temporal anchors typically used in death investigations. Without them, investigators were left to rely on indirect indicators rather than contemporaneous documentation. Law enforcement did not release estimated times of death for either adult. There was no mention of medical examiner assessments regarding postmortem changes that might indicate a window of hours. The public record therefore lacks confirmation as to whether the deaths occurred shortly before discovery or significantly earlier. This uncertainty does not contradict the official classification, but it constrains the precision with which the sequence can be understood. The role of the missed church event became increasingly central. It was not merely a scheduling detail, but the trigger that exposed the deaths. Had that absence gone unnoticed for longer, discovery might have been delayed further. Conversely, had there been a routine check earlier, the timeline might have narrowed. Instead, the sequence rests on a single point of concern, making the chronology dependent on social routine rather than objective measurement. No official statement clarified whether investigators were able to determine which individual died first. No information was released regarding whether the child had been awake, asleep, or moving freely within the home during the relevant period. These omissions are consistent with protecting the privacy of a minor, but they also remove potential contextual clues from public view. By the end of the available reporting, the timeline was defined by boundaries rather than specifics. The deaths occurred sometime before the missed event, and discovery followed shortly thereafter. Everything between those points remains compressed into an undefined interval. The tighter the timeline became, the more apparent its internal gaps appeared. Based strictly on the disclosed information, the investigative timeline appears to rely heavily on circumstantial markers rather than fixed forensic benchmarks. This reliance suggests that while investigators may possess internal indicators supporting their conclusions, the publicly available chronology is likely to remain approximate, limiting definitive reconstruction and leaving certain aspects of sequence and timing unresolved. Evidence that raises questions. The classification of the deaths as a murder-suicide necessarily implies the existence of evidence sufficient, in the view of investigators, to meet an internal evidentiary threshold. However, public reporting and official statements released to date provide only limited insight into what specific evidence supported that determination. The gap between conclusion and disclosure has become one of the most closely examined aspects of the case, not because contrary evidence has been presented, but because critical categories of evidence have not been described at all. Authorities confirmed that both adults died from gunshot wounds, yet no additional forensic detail has been made public. There's been no disclosure regarding the recovery of a firearm at the scene, the condition or placement of any such weapon, or whether ballistic testing was conducted to link a weapon to specific wounds. No information has been released regarding shell casings, bullet trajectories, or impact points within the residence. In the absence of these details, it remains unclear how investigators establish sequence, directionality, or agency. Within the first 50 words of publicly available forensic description, the record effectively ends. There are no references to gunshot residue testing, which is commonly used to assess whether an individual discharged a firearm. There is no indication whether residue samples were collected, whether those samples yielded results, or whether any findings were inconclusive due to degradation or contamination risk. The absence of such information does not imply its non-existence, but it does limit the evidentiary picture available for external evaluation. Autopsy findings have likewise not been summarized in public statements. No cause of death report beyond gunshot wounds has been released. There is no discussion of wound characteristics that might distinguish between self-inflicted and externally inflicted injuries, nor any mention of stippling, muzzle distance, or entry and exit analysis. Without these elements, the scientific basis for assigning roles within the murder-suicide framework remains undisclosed. Another limitation emerges. No time of death estimates have been publicly provided. Medical examiner assessments often include approximations based on physiological indicators, but no such estimates have been cited. As a result, the temporal relationship between the two deaths cannot be independently assessed using the public record. The evidentiary narrative establishes outcome without anchoring sequence. Additionally, there has been no reference to digital evidence. Public reporting does not indicate whether investigators examined phone records, text messages, or other electronic data to establish the final interactions between the individuals involved. While such evidence may exist and may have informed investigative conclusions, it has not been referenced as part of the rationale for the announced classification. It becomes apparent that the evidence raising questions is defined less by contradiction than by omission. No alternative theories have been publicly advanced, and no inconsistencies have been formally acknowledged. Yet the absence of disclosed forensic benchmarks means that the evidentiary chain supporting the conclusion cannot be traced from observation to inference using available information. Based solely on the material released through official statements and public reporting, the evidentiary foundation for the murder-suicide designation appears to rely on investigative findings that have not been articulated in the public domain. While this is not unusual in cases involving deceased suspects and no pending prosecution, it suggests that the conclusions rest on internal assessments rather than evidence subjected to external scrutiny, a dynamic that may leave certain questions unresolved despite administrative closure. Statements under scrutiny. As the investigation moved forward and official classifications were issued, attention increasingly shifted to the statements provided by individuals familiar with the household. Among those most frequently cited in public reporting was Charles Maple, an 80-year-old neighbor who lived across the street from the couple. Maple's remarks, published through People, offered observational context rather than evidentiary fact, yet they became central to how the case was interpreted outside official channels. His statements did not introduce new information about the scene itself, but they shaped understanding of the period preceding the deaths. Maple stated that he had known Christina Chambers and her husband, Johnny Rhymes Jr., since they were dating and later married, describing them as outwardly happy during much of that time. He emphasized that he had never observed Chambers express fear for her safety or concern for her child's well-being. This assertion is significant in that it directly addresses the presence or absence of known warning signs. However, it is limited by its scope, reflecting only what was externally visible and verbally shared with a neighbor. Within the first 50 words of Maple's remarks, a distinction was drawn between appearance and internal reality. He stated that in the last 2 years, something about the couple was not right, though he could not identify specific incidents or behaviors that would independently substantiate that impression. His description was intuitive rather than factual, framed as a personal sense developed over time rather than a reaction to observable events. Such impressions, while relevant to context, do not constitute evidence and are not verifiable through documentation. Maple acknowledged the limits of his own knowledge. He indicated that he did not want to dwell on what he sensed and admitted that he could not know what occurred inside the home. This acknowledgement is critical, as it delineates the boundary between external observation and private conduct. The statement underscores how little of domestic life is accessible to outside witnesses, even those in close proximity. Maple further stated that while he was shocked by the news of the deaths, he was not entirely surprised upon learning that the case was being treated as a murder-suicide. This reaction has been widely quoted, yet reflects retrospective interpretation rather than contemporaneous concern. There is no indication that Maple reported any concerns to authorities prior to the incident, nor that he witnessed behavior that would have prompted intervention. His comments emerged only after the outcome was known. The distinction between narrative reinforcement and investigative contribution becomes clear. Maple's observations neither contradict nor confirm the official findings. They provide background but do not resolve factual uncertainties regarding motive, sequence, or causation. Importantly, law enforcement has not indicated that neighbor testimony formed the basis of the murder-suicide classification. Beyond Maple, no other neighbors or acquaintances were cited in public reporting as having raised concerns or provided detailed observations. There were no accounts of prior police calls, domestic disturbances, or formal complaints associated with the residents. The absence of such records does not establish stability, but it does limit the documented behavioral history available for review. Statements from neighbors, including Maples, appear to function primarily as retrospective framing rather than investigative substantiation. While they suggest that external perceptions may not fully reflect internal dynamics, they do not provide concrete indicators that will materially alter the evidentiary assessment. As a result, these statements are likely to remain contextual rather than determinative, offering insight into perception without resolving the factual gaps that persist in the case record. What is not released? As the investigation progressed and the deaths were publicly classified as a murder-suicide, a parallel feature of the case became increasingly apparent: the volume of information that remained undisclosed. While authorities confirmed the manner of death in categorical terms, they did not release the underlying materials that typically accompany such determinations in the public record. This absence did not constitute an irregularity in procedural terms, but it did define the boundaries within which the case could be independently understood. From the outset, law enforcement did not publish autopsy findings for either adult. No medical examiner summaries were released outlining wound trajectories, distance determinations, or comparative injury analysis. Without these details, it is not possible to assess whether the fatal gunshot wounds were consistent with close-range discharge, intermediate distance, or other conditions that might inform sequence or intent. Officials did not state whether the wounds yielded gunshot residue patterns sufficient to establish firing position or order of death. The lack of such disclosure leaves a significant evidentiary layer unexamined in the public domain. Ballistic information was similarly absent. Authorities did not confirm whether a firearm was recovered at the scene, where it was located, or to whom it was registered. No statement referenced ballistic matching, shell casing recovery, or whether the weapon involved was subjected to functional testing. In cases designated as murder-suicide, weapon placement and ballistic correlation often play a central role in classification. Here, those elements were not addressed publicly. The conclusion was shared, but the physical pathway to that conclusion was not. There was also no release of forensic laboratory findings. No DNA testing was referenced, whether from a weapon, ammunition components, or other surfaces within the residence. No mention was made of fingerprint analysis or whether any samples yielded partial markers, degraded profiles, or inconclusive results. Without such information, it cannot be determined whether forensic evidence uniquely supported the investigative theory or merely failed to contradict it. Time of death analysis represents another area of non-disclosure. Authorities did not provide estimated times of death, nor did they indicate whether post-mortem indicators allowed investigators to establish relative sequencing between the two fatalities. The absence of these details means that the publicly available record does not clarify whether investigators can definitively state which individual died first, or whether the deaths occurred in rapid succession. This uncertainty persists despite the application of a definitive classification. Additionally, law enforcement did not release scene diagrams, photographs, or summaries of bloodstain pattern analysis. There was no indication of whether trajectory reconstruction was performed or whether scene layout was considered determinative. Surveillance footage from nearby residences, if reviewed, was not referenced. Cell phone records, digital communications, or location data were not mentioned in any official or public reporting. Importantly, authorities did not explain why specific materials were withheld, nor did they indicate whether such information would be released at a later stage. The investigation was described as ongoing, but no milestones or anticipated disclosures were outlined. As a result, the scope of what remains undisclosed is not clearly bounded. Based solely on public reporting and official statements, the evidentiary foundation supporting the murder-suicide classification exists largely outside public view. While this does not imply insufficiency, it does mean that the case, as presented publicly, rests on institutional authority rather than transparent evidentiary demonstration. In the absence of released forensic or analytical detail, certain questions are likely to remain unresolved, and the full evidentiary narrative may never enter the public record. Behavioral context examined. Public reporting surrounding the deaths placed notable emphasis on behavioral observations offered by individuals familiar with the household. particularly those living nearby. These accounts did not arise from formal investigative interviews released by law enforcement, but from media statements that sought to contextualize the relationship and domestic environment preceding the incident. While such observations are not evidentiary in a forensic sense, they often influence how a case is interpreted once an official classification has been applied. A neighbor, identified in reporting as Charles Maple, age 80, stated that he had known the couple for several years and had observed their relationship from its early stages through marriage. According to his account, the couple outwardly appeared happy for much of that time. He described no prior expressions of fear by Christina Chambers regarding her personal safety or the safety of her child. These statements were consistent across multiple quotations and did not suggest awareness of imminent danger or escalating conflict. In isolation, such observations tend to support the absence of visible warning signs rather than confirm their presence. However, Maple also stated that within the last 2 years he had sensed that something was not right. This perception was described as an impression rather than a specific incident, grounded in intermittent conversations and personal intuition rather than documented events. He emphasized that he did not pursue the feeling or seek clarification, characterizing it as an unease that lacked a definable source. From an investigative standpoint, such retrospective impressions are inherently limited. They do not establish behavior, intent, or action, but they do illustrate how outcomes can reshape the interpretation of past interactions. A clear distinction emerges between observable conduct and inferred meaning. No report cited arguments, threats, or domestic disturbances. No prior police calls to the residence were mentioned. No protective orders, complaints, or documented interventions were referenced in either official statements or public reporting. The behavioral record, as available, is notable more for what it lacks than for what it contains. The absence of documented conflict does not preclude private instability, but also does not substantiate it. Investigative standards generally treat behavioral context as supplementary, particularly when unsupported by contemporaneous records. In this case, the available context consists largely of third-party recollections offered after the fact, filtered through awareness of the outcome. Such recollections are vulnerable to hindsight bias, a factor well recognized in post-incident analysis. It becomes evident that behavioral context served primarily to humanize the individuals involved rather than to clarify causation. Descriptions of Chambers as dedicated, professional, and well-regarded within her community were accurate but non-probative. They neither align with nor contradict the murder-suicide classification, as outward demeanor is not a reliable predictor of private actions. Importantly, law enforcement did not cite behavioral history as a basis for their conclusion. No official statement suggested that neighbor observations, personality traits, or relational impressions informed the investigative determination. The behavioral narrative exists alongside the formal investigation, not within it. Based strictly on material disclosed, the behavioral context appears insufficient to materially support or undermine the official classification. The reliance on retrospective impressions highlights the limitations of behavioral analysis in the absence of documented incidents, suggesting that any definitive interpretation of motive or relational dynamics is likely to remain speculative and unresolved without corroborating evidence. Public reaction and pushback. As the classification of the deaths as a murder-suicide entered public circulation, reaction unfolded in a measured but increasingly questioning manner. Initial responses largely mirror the language of official statements, repeating confirmed facts while refraining from overt challenge. Coverage emphasized the loss of life, the presence of a young child who was physically unharmed, and the professional background of Christina Chambers. At this early stage, public engagement reflected acceptance rather than dispute, shaped in part by the absence of competing information and the authority attached to law enforcement conclusions. Within the first 50 words of public reaction, attention centered on sympathy and acknowledgement rather than analysis. Community members, colleagues, and institutions issued statements of condolence. These responses did not address investigative substance. They functioned as social recognition of loss, not as commentary on causation. The initial tone suggested closure before scrutiny had fully formed. As reporting continued, however, a subtle shift became apparent. While the murder-suicide designation remained largely uncontested, questions emerged regarding the lack of disclosed detail. Observers noted that the announcement did not identify which individual was believed to have carried out the shooting, nor did it provide supporting forensic explanation. These observations were not framed as accusations, but as acknowledgments of informational absence. The pushback did not arise from contradiction, but from silence. The presence of the child became a focal point of concern. Public discussion emphasized the circumstances under which the child was found unharmed and alone. Although no evidence suggested harm or neglect, the scenario itself prompted questions about timing and sequence. These questions did not challenge the official classification directly, but they highlighted areas where clarification had not been offered. The nature of public scrutiny became more defined. It was not adversarial, but procedural. The absence of released autopsy findings, ballistic data, or time-of-death estimates led some observers to note that the conclusion rested on undisclosed evidence. This observation did not imply error, but underscored the reliance on institutional authority rather than publicly verifiable documentation. The case was accepted as explained, yet not fully understood. Importantly, no organized campaign disputing the murder-suicide determination emerged in available reporting. There were no competing theories advanced with evidentiary support, and no named sources contradicting law enforcement statements. Pushback, where it existed, remained limited to calls for transparency rather than reclassification. This restraint reflected both the sensitivity of the case and the lack of publicly available facts upon which to base alternative interpretations. Law enforcement did not respond publicly to questions beyond reiterating that the investigation remained ongoing. This position maintained procedural consistency, but did not expand the factual record. As a result, public reaction stabilized into a state of quiet uncertainty rather than escalation. The case remained present in coverage, but without new information, discussion plateaued. Based solely on public reporting, the reaction to the case reflects a dynamic in which official conclusions are largely accepted in the absence of contradictory evidence, yet remain subject to low-level scrutiny due to limited disclosure. This form of pushback does not challenge the authority of the investigation, but it preserves unresolved questions that may persist precisely because the evidentiary basis for conclusion has not been fully articulated in the public record. The deaths of Christina Chambers and Johnny Rhymes Jr. have been formally classified as a murder-suicide based on official statements. That conclusion, while authoritative, rests on evidence that has not been fully articulated in the public domain. The available record confirms outcome, but not process. Without physical evidence presented for independent evaluation, probability suggests the official finding will stand. At the same time, gaps in timeline, forensic disclosure, and contextual detail mean that aspects of the case remain unresolved and likely to remain unsolved in the public understanding. Even as administrative closure is reached,